Hello and welcome to the CEO Blindspots show, where leaders lead leaders. I'm your host, Birgit Kamps, and today's guest is Boe Hartman, who is the co-founder and CTO of Nomi Health, which is a company that is disrupting the way people are paying for healthcare. Welcome to the show, Boe.
Hey, how you doing? And thank you for having me today.
Yeah, it was my pleasure, and I'm so grateful that our mutual friend Tanya Tilovich connected us because she doesn't give compliments easily, and she said Bo is an outstanding leader, and I'm so grateful he was my mentor at Goldman Sachs. So really interested in your leadership
Uh,
tactics. She also said you bring out the best in people, including her.
uh,
But then she also said something that I don't hear a lot about leaders. And I
mm.
quote, she said, Bo represents the essence of a disruptor in the most positive sense. So I thought, you know what? Why don't we start by saying what inspired you to now disrupt the healthcare payment
It,
system and what's wrong with it in the USA
it,
right now?
Yeah, first off, Tanya is awesome. I loved working with Tanya on a daily basis. Her background is massively interesting and it shows courage of someone leaving their home nation and starting over again. So she's one of my favorite people. So what made me decide to leave about 25 years of international technology banking and move to the healthcare space in 2020 was the fact that if you think about what the industry represents and that we don't actually think about what it represents in our daily lives. So when I think about the problems we have in the United States, we don't talk about healthcare and getting efficient healthcare delivered in the US. What we talk about emotional political stances of someone getting between me and my doctor. But if we think about it, just think about the industry as a scale problem. In the United States, we hear about every day on the news that we spend over $1 trillion a year on military spending. What's interesting is we spend more than number two and number three in the world, China and Russia. If you add those two together, they're only 50% of what we spend. If you take the top 23 of spenders in the world, they still don't equal what the United States spends on military spending, and that's $1 trillion a year. Also, we service $1.3 trillion of interest on our national debt on a yearly basis, and we hear about that on a very regular basis. If you look at the United States healthcare system, we spent in 2024 $4.9 trillion on healthcare. That
Wow.
dwarfs those two numbers. Dwarfs those two numbers.
The
But if we
blind
think about
spot in the industry.
that, that is definitely a blind spot in the industry. And so for me, when I looked about it and I was approached by my co-founders to say, hey, we actually want to do something and how do we actually make healthcare more efficient in the United States? And we think the underlying issue is around payments. And that's a deep market. Those numbers I gave you are deep market. But we are number one in the world in infant mortality rate, obesity, cancers, other comorbidities. And we spend more than anybody on the planet. And so to me, I went, there's a problem to be solved and truly an important calling that one could do. And that's what brought me in with my curiosity to say, what is it that needs to be solved to make America much healthier?
Well, I love that you said curiosity. And, I am curious. I mean, you were a partner at Goldman Sachs and,
Yeah.
you were used to leading an organization of 3,000 employees and all that. And then you left that to start, your company with your co-founders. And that's quite a shift. So clearly you were very passionate about your mission. And then also I'm curious, what were the biggest shifts you saw as a leader
Right.
being, in a large company versus, your own company?
That's something I've been reflecting on a lot on in the last past 5 years. It really has. And your question is a lot of different aspects that we pack together, especially here in the United States, where we worship the wonderkins who start their companies. I have to tell you, the differences they're pronounced, but they're not too far away. Meaning, so I started my career working for the U.S. Army as a contractor. That's where by the way, I found out where people with passion and a calling can do incredible things, right? So when these soldiers put on the uniform every day, they were representing the people who came before them, and that really implanted on me of something that was something incredible. I also saw bureaucracy that made your eyes water. There had something called mil specs, documents that thick to tell you how to fill out a RFP, and I sat in a room with walls covered in these things, and I had to go look up on page 2000 of one document to figure out how to fill out an RFP, and that also imprinted on me as of the bureaucracy. then I was lucky enough, I got recruited to come to Capital One in the early days. And for those of you in the United States, Capital One, was a storied company, still is a storied company that reinvented the way that credit was issued to Americans to really, really allow them to purchase things that they normally hadn't been able to purchase on credit. Then recruited, and there I learned about speed, velocity, hypergrowth, and that really, really brought that in. And so I learned a version of startup, a
Mm,
version of fast and innovation and letting your curiosity drive. We would go off and do things that most other banks would not do. Went to Barclays, at the time was a 325-year-old English bank. That is calcification actually personified. But I learned how to operate at scale, and that's where I had an organization of about 3,000 people. And I learned to operate on how do you take an organization that was stuck in a victimized mindset and make
mhm,
them more curious. And I got recruited by Goldman Sachs to build the consumer bank and Apple Card. And if you would have told that 18-year-old farm boy in Virginia that he was going to be a Goldman Sachs partner one day, I would have laughed massively. But made partner Goldman, and then I joined a peer startup. So if you look at it, it was large bureaucracy, largest in the world, to an innovative startup company that that was at scale when it was started, to a large bureaucratic international firm, to the famous Goldman Sachs. And then to Nomi, which when I joined, I think I was employee number 9. I saw my employee number the other day, which shocked me. I was employee number 9. And on my first day, by the way, my first day of work, I was setting up Outlook inboxes. So I went from being a partner to setting up email systems. And so what did I learn as far as leadership? And it was great. So working for the Army and Capital One, I learned how to operate inside communities, right? So bureaucracy and hypergrowth. So my leadership style there was more of bringing communities together and telling folks we can take them. Barclays is where I started forging what leadership meant and what did messaging mean, and how do you actually message and connect yourself to the organization so that they believe in the message and they believe in the mission. Goldman, I took the playbook of all those things I'd experimented with, and how I elevated myself to become a voice in the industry. And then I resetted that, like, so pinnacle, then I reset that to walk into a startup to where I had to explain to people, this is how you work together as a group. This is what it means to be accountable to other people. To where I had to actually break out, frameworks I used in my early 20s, like around action cycles and how to communicate back and forth, because those skills didn't exist for some of these young individuals. And I'd been separated because I lived in frameworks that had been built, right? So think about this. Army built, like, you just did what those mil specs told you to do. Capital One, we were just a bunch of energetic young people. The median age when I was there was 28. And we were just running around building stuff with technology and seeing how we could make something grow very quickly. Barclays, it taught me how to take those lessons of leadership that I saw before and give it to a mass group of people. But it also taught me one of the biggest secrets about leadership. Goldman, it's how to get out of my imposter syndrome and actually take a seat at the table. And then coming to Nomi, it was about how do you go back to how do you put yourself after you've been at the top of the mountain in the shoes of young folks starting out in their career in a pandemic and making a difference? And how do you connect to them in that golf? And I never felt okay boomer more than when I had to sit with these folks, because there were no frameworks, there were no middle managers, there were no processes.
yes.
And I'd been operating in that way. So how did I come back and remind myself I too was an apprentice at one point in my life? And how do I connect with them at that point? Kind of a long story to get there, but I think it's important to see those layers
Yes.
of how to come back to it and put yourself back into the seat of these young professionals starting out in the career,
Yeah.
separated from each other, and then also being in the field servicing hundreds of thousands of people a day.
Yeah. Wow. That's a rich explanation with so many great points that I want to unravel. But let me start by asking you, you said you were employee number 9, but you're a co-founder. How many co-founders are there?
So there's only three of us. So at Nomi Health, so the CEO is a gentleman by the name Mark Newman. Mark Newman started a company called HireView, which was the first video interviewing platform of its kind. He invented the category. Mark and I met when I was at Barclays. I used to go to Silicon Valley every year to meet with clients, investment companies, as well as young startups, and he was on the list. My other co-founder is Josh Walker, who is an industry expert in healthcare, been in the industry for multiple years, worked for the large institutions. And it was when Mark and his wife had one of their children. Mark was at the hospital, and at the end of the stay for his wife, an administrator came in and said, "Congratulations, you two. Welcome. I'm glad to see your baby's healthy. I have your bill. Before you leave, I need to pay for it." Mark handed over his HSA credit card, and the young lady said, how much should I put on it? And he goes, "Pay it all off." And she goes, "Oh, you're going to pay it today. You get 25% off." And as an entrepreneur, he went, "Wait a second. Whoa, what was that?" He met Josh Walker, who had been thinking about this for many years of, if you were actually to bring cash pay like that into the medical world, what problems would you solve? You would solve the fact of that providers would get paid in real time. They would get paid. You could organize the contracts where they get paid in full. Because as of right now in the United States, most people don't realize this, is when I give you those big numbers of $4.9 trillion, here's something that most people don't realize. Typically, doctors don't get paid for 9 months to a year. Typically, when you see a price of a service, it is not that price. So, for example, a real life story I think I shared with you, I had to get an MRI on my back. I called up the MRI facility and they said, "Hey, it's going to take us 2 weeks to get pre-authorization from your insurance company, and it's going to cost $2,500. And I said, "Well, what if I paid cash?" They said, "Oh, you're going to pay cash." And I said, "Morning, my deductible was six." So paying cash got me in the next morning, and that's the true cost of healthcare, and that's the point that we're trying to tell the world, and that's what Josh didn't realize. The true cost of healthcare in the United States is not those numbers you see. Now, I'm not talking about catastrophic, diagnoses and stuff like that, right? Like, my wife is coming to the end of a 3-year journey on cancer diagnosis. That was very expensive, right? Stuff that we go through day to day. Even some surgeries aren't that expensive. And we have created this calcified industry here that has allowed just a few companies to sit at the top of it to create a monopolistic pricing structure. And it takes forever to get providers to get paid, which means a lot of these providers are going out of business. They're getting bought up by private equity firms. And so if you actually change it to where you actually figure out how to pay the real price of healthcare and you pay the doctors in real time, guess what happens? You can reduce the cost of healthcare for self-insured companies by 20, 30, 40%. And we're doing it. We're doing it in the market today.
Well, I definitely hope, a lot of people hear, a lot of leaders hear this podcast, because I know when I was running my other company, it was 25 to 35% increase in costs every year. And like you said, a lot of employees were frustrated by how long it took to get, things done and get their reimbursement or whatever else because of the bureaucracy involved in all that. So I'm really grateful you guys are doing that.
It's
Definitely
insane. Here's the thing is I used to quote medical spend in the United States for 2024 to be $4.5 trillion. We just got the updated numbers in December for 2024, and it was 4.9 trillion. So it even went up,
Wow.
went up that much within the year estimate. And as a business owner or the leaders, I'm sure they're sitting out there right now and they're having their benefits leader come to them and say, "Oh, by the way, costs are going to go up by 10% a year." But if you actually go talk to providers or nurses or clinicians, they're going out of business. How's that possible? Where's those inefficiencies that are affecting these markets and not allowing us to get the care? And so that's what we're going after, and that's how we're attacking it. And as in most societies, by the way, what you find out is that just follow the money. We've all learned that. Just follow the money. And being a banker, I know how to follow that money. And quite frankly, the first thing that I noticed in the first, how mirrors the banking industry, but it's about 10 to 15 to 20 years behind, right? So,
Can you say more about what you mean by that?
yeah, pre 2008, if you looked at that, for example, the reason why Capital One was so incredibly successful is because they went in and they actually were issuing credit cards with credit balances to people who normally couldn't get access to it, which then fueled the ability for folks to go out and purchase, right? That opened up an entire market for incredible companies to come in and allow people to buy on credit, which then could establish credit. And there's some good and bad sides of that, but generally it's good for the economy and it moved the economy forward, right? So, but before then, a lot of people don't remember or realize this. Before then, like for example, it was the 1970s when Barclays issued the first credit card to a woman. Before then, a husband had to sign for a woman to get a credit card. I remember actually the first credit card my wife got, I had to co-sign it as her husband. Think about how we used to pay. Like everything was cash or check. Absolutely. I mean, I remember that. I remember standing in line and having your social security number still in your check at the grocery store when we signed that. So it was very calcified, and it wasn't very customer efficient for us to do things, right? We couldn't move money, we couldn't pay each other by tapping phones, we couldn't do those sorts of things. Post 2008, right, we got into the digital wallet wars. Technology and the fintechs came in, and they actually pushed innovation. I remember sitting in a room with the CEO of Barclay Card, and they brought me in because of what the impacts of these fintechs were, right? That, how were these fintechs rising up? We didn't have to worry about them. And I said, here's the funny thing, because everyone's like either destroy because they're innovative. And actually, we do not want to go into a war with the fintechs at all. What we want to do is we want to embrace them. And everybody in the room gasped, or, how dare you? We must destroy them. And I went, no. I said, because, and this was when I was at Barclays. I said, look, we're a large bank. We have scale. And to develop scale is hard. You ran your own business. Developing organically is challenging. And we see that in examples of even Marcus when I built that and Nomi. But we have scale already. What the fintechs have is they have curiosity. They have curiosity to allow them to bring innovation in, to experiment, to try, to do things that we can't, because we have to go through a risk matrices and then a budget process, which says, the answer is no. Now, what's really cool is, why don't we partner with them, and we'll give them growth. They'll give us innovation. It was like, no, we're going to hone the customer experience. This is what we're going to go do. Funny side note, that for those folks who are curious, Barclays, when I was at Barclay Card, built the first tap and pay phone in the world, and we sold 6 of them. It was horrible. It was terrible. But we beat everybody else to it, because we wanted to innovate everything ourselves. Whereas I said, no, if we embrace this other part of the economy, embrace these smart, curious people, and we partner with them and give them an opportunity, they'd explode. That's one of the ways I met Mark. Is I said, Mark, what do startups need from me? And he said, they just need your time, Boe. They can get money. They need your time. To be able to sit with someone like you and ask questions and get an opportunity to show you something is the world to them. And that was how Mark and I's friendship started. And so when that partnership took place, when I went to markets, because what I did is, when Goldman hired me, I said, I'm going to partner with these startups, and I'm going to bring the innovation. So if somebody's doing something that I don't have to do and I can borrow it, I'm going to borrow it, which allowed me from the first line of code to the first customer. Marcus at Goldman Sachs was 10 months, unheard of. I was employee number 1. I was the first engineer that walked into that building under Marcus. 10 months later, we were servicing customers, unheard of, because it was a partnership. Now, how does that mirror what we see here? So in this industry currently, you have large corporations. They're not innovating. They give lip service to innovation. They don't innovate. Why don't they have to? They have a captive market, right? And like you said, my rates were going up 10% a year. But could someone explain to you why? Did you walk out of there and know why?
No good answer was given.
Right. It was just because.
Yep.
And they're where banking was pre-2008, where it's just like, we don't have to do anything. We just sit here. There's no threat from the outside. No one's actually pushing us to innovate. No one's actually pushing us to push down money prices. And when people speak up, no one, it doesn't seem to go anywhere. So that's why here at Nomi, we believe that we're going to empower the self-insured employers, the third-party administrators, and others to reduce their costs and actually allow them to get the same doctor, same care for less price, get the insights to actions, get pharmaceuticals cheaper, and actually move money better, so it makes the industry better. That's what we're doing. And that's the blind spot. Is, to your point, people just look at this, but why? What can we do different? How can I impact that market? So
if I were to follow the money, would that help me identify some stuff too?
Yeah. So following the money. So one of the crazy things that happened when I got over here is, I always heard about how regulated this space is, and I always heard about how complex and difficult it was. And I was like, well, I'm curious. I want to be a student again. Like, remember I talked about, I was setting up email boxes the first day. I became a student again, right? So I showed up, 3 months before. I was a partner at Goldman Sachs. You say those words, it means something across the globe. Next thing I'm the guy who messed up your inbox, and I had no idea how this industry worked. So I started being a student again, being a novice again, and I declared I'm a student. I don't know how this stuff works. This is what I found on that sort of parallel to the banking world, right? As I dug in, they always talked about fintechs can't operate in the banking world because the barriers of entries are too high, regulations are too high, and it's too complex. That's a defense mechanism. That's the immune system reacting to it. By the way, this industry, the healthcare industry, is nowhere near regulated like banking, not even close. Inside of banking, I was regulated by several federal organizations. I was regulated by state organizations, and I was regulated by international organizations, all at the exact same time. And they would all come in the room, all of them together at the same time, and tell you 5 different things that you
Mm.
had to go do, right? In this world, there's no national regulation. There's a few, but they're more like guidelines than they are anything else. HIPAA, people point to HIPAA. Quite frankly, HIPAA, what we've seen with the Change Healthcare hack, which is the 1 year anniversary of, HIPAA is fairly benign in its way that it protects. It's only a protection of use. It's not a protection of anything else. It's just a protection of use of data. And there are no accountabilities like you're held to in banking, right? For at all. Like for example, Andrew Whitty after the Change Healthcare hack, which is the CEO of United Healthcare, he had to get subpoenaed to come to Congress to talk about it. And even then, his answers were very high level. If it would have been in banking, Jamie Dimon would have been on the Hill with his head on a pike right away, right? So
Yeah.
it just indicates to you how that is actually the state of play of where we're at. And so for me, getting into this and actually seeing the ability to make these changes by using these examples really is what something that I went, this is how we can make the massive change if we use curiosity and we use technology and we use these startups to help us influence what's going on here.
Yeah. Well, then I'm going to go back to thank goodness you are curious and are willing to, figure out how to have a beginner's mindset, so to speak. And, it sounds like one of the things, like Tanya said, you're really good at bringing out the best in people. It sounds like you're also really good at partnering with good people and collaborating. So what would you say, if you had 1 or 2 tips for smaller company leaders, because a lot of them right now are struggling, they feel like they're the only ones, they're feeling lonely.
uh,
What would you say in terms of, either what worked for you as a leader, or what mistakes you made, or blind spots you had that they should prevent?
yeah, I don't know if this is a good fit here, but this is one of the most impactful things that ever happened to me. And it's when I went to Barclays. And I think this works across the board. I discovered what true vulnerability as a leader means and how you would connect with your communities. Right. So, coming up through the generations I did, we had the strong leader, right? They call them the red leaders, which are, I'm going to lead you this way, wartime leaders, which I have immense amount of respect for. But that also leaves out the ability to be vulnerable, saying, I don't know. I don't know where we're going to go. I don't know how we're going to get there. Right. A couple of months ago, the whole founder mode thing that kicked off, I just never really, did you follow that, by the way? The whole founder mode thing?
Probably not like you did.
Yeah, there was a tweet or something that a founder did. It's like, I'm in founder mode and put a manifesto together. Anytime someone puts a manifesto together, that really makes me nervous. But put a man and what founder mode is, have all the answers, drive through it, and go forward. What I learned coming out of it was that I don't have all the answers, and sometimes I get in my team's own way.
Mm.
And so where that grew ahead for me was multiple successes. I've had successes and failures. One of the things though is I always try to reflect and learn from those failures and those successes. I always tell people, don't get too used to the peaks and valleys of your career because those are just temporary spots or they're sugar rushes. Focus on the plateaus because that's where the foundation is really built. And one of those plateaus that I was on was at Barclays after I'd been there for a couple of years. And I came in, I put together a great leadership organization. During the interview, I was told I was joining the worst group in the worst organization. I joined, and the person who said that to me was not wrong, but it wasn't, they weren't wrong in the fact that these were good people. I only replaced 2 people on the leadership team when I took it over the 4.5 years I was there. It was
Mm.
because they lost their curiosity and they got into a victim mindset. So when I got there, I wanted to say, how do I invigorate curiosity, right? How do I actually bring the curiosity out? So that's step one. I would tell leaders is the organization curious? Is there a way to lead through risk? Is risk punished? Punished, people talk about, oh, if you're not breaking enough things, then you're not innovating enough. I kind of go, there's got to be a balance. You can't break everything. But on the other side, is risk punished? So as I brought that curiosity into the organization, we made a lot of strides. The turning point for me is then you hit this plateau. And what happens is leaders go into their own head and they get stuck in that head and they start second guessing themselves, and imposter syndrome starts rising up, and they start going, I'm on a plateau. I can't take us to the next level. What happens? And it becomes a very dark space and it becomes quite lonely. And you start isolating yourself from other things because you just don't know how to explain it and how you move through it. I hit the same thing at Barclays. We hit a plateau. I couldn't go forward. The organization wasn't making as big strides as it was. And so we did this thing every year. Like most banks, we did self assessments, and we also did end of the year reviews. I got my end of the review back, and I decided I was going to read my end of the year review to my entire organization unredacted. Unredacted. I had 3,000 people that I was leading. And so my chief of staff and head of HR arranged it so I did 2 in India and 2 in Europe so that we could televise it across the entire organization around the globe. When it was found out that I was going to do that, I got a phone call from a very high up in Barclay saying, you can't lead your review to your organization. I said, is it against policy? They went, no. I said, is it against review? I mean, is it against rules? They went, nope. I said, so why can't? And they said, because if you do it, they're going to expect us all to do it. And I said, sounds like a you problem, not a me problem. I'm going to do it anyways. So I got up. And what I did is I ran people through my review, unredacted, by the way, up on the giant screen so the world could see. And what I did is I was pointing out all the nice things that were said, right? Hey, you're a great partner. You collaborate. You know technology. You're really awesome when it comes to this. You know how to bring the best out of everyone. But in the bottom of each and every one of them, there were these other words that when I reflected upon them, they said to me, tell us where you're taking us from technology. How are you leading us forward? These are peers saying these words to me. Tell us what the next phase is of how you're going to help me grow my business. These were pleas from peers to me because technology underpins everything that we do in business today, right? And without it, you really don't have a business. The way that my brain interpreted it, because I was in that dark space and I was in that imposter syndrome, and because I was closing down on myself, it was, but I don't want to make a mistake. I don't want to sound stupid. I don't want to say something that people are going to laugh at me about. I don't want to come across that I know something and it turns out I was wrong and then get embarrassed. All of those behaviors and emotional thoughts was holding an entire organization back. So as I was reading that review to everybody, I stopped and I told my entire organization. And the reason why that we're not making the gains that I think we should is because I am scared. I said those words. I said, I am scared. It is me. I am terrified of making these mistakes, and I'm holding each and every one of you back. I said that 4 times, televised around the globe, and you would have sworn that the air in the room was sucked up. I literally heard an audible gasp. I looked at my chief of staff. She turned pale white the first time I said it. The first time I said it, she turned pale white. She couldn't believe it. This is an English bank. The 4th time she was there, because we recorded it, the 4th time I did it, I asked her, I said, what you've been through all of these. What do you think now? And she said, I've heard you do this 4 times in a row now, and I know exactly where in the talk that's going to come from. And each and every time I still get goosebumps. Right. Yeah. I looked up the center of the first time I did it, up the room, and my head of development globally and my head of HR both had tears in their eyes. Because in that moment, I knew that everybody in that room had something to be scared of. Yes. In that moment, I gave, why I was doing it completely selfishly for myself, I gave permission to others to say, it's okay to say you're scared. It's okay to say, it's beyond I don't know. It's I am scared. And by saying those words in a safe spot, that organization skyrocketed after that point. We were blowing the doors off of things. We did things that literally changed the game. And it's funny, I just talked to an executive who's gone to another international bank recently who joined Barclays after I left. And he goes, and he and I never actually met until we talked recently. He said to me, he goes, it was so funny. He said, my time there was always, oh, Boe did that. Boe did that. Boe did that. And I attribute it to the moment when I got up and I admitted to myself and I admitted to all those people. I'm scared. The greatest moment, though, was at the end of that. In India, they call them a fresher, which is a young professional. She came up to me and she said, "You know what? I was scared too." And I said, "Well, we can be scared together." She goes, "I'm not scared no more." And I went, "Really?" And she went, "Yes." She said, "Because if you can get up there and say you're scared," she goes, "I can say I'm scared."
Yeah.
And I said, "Well, you know what? We will do this together." And the organization just took off. And to this day, when I run across old people who sat in that room or any one of those rooms, they said, to this day, it was one of the greatest professional moments in life. They don't understand it was my greatest professional moment in life because that was a blind spot. I was hiding it from myself. And when it hit me, I said, I'm going to go do this. So long story, but it changed who I was in that moment to let me go forward. So you can still find the same farm boy with West Virginia roots in there, but that moment changed the trajectory of my career.
Wow. So that's pretty big. And you mentioned that that was a blind spot for you. And you've mentioned a few times that you get curious. What was the moment that were you just looking at the plateau and the numbers, or were you asking yourself, or being curious about what can I do different? What was the aha moment that you chose to do that? Because that's a huge risk. Others would say that was probably the
Oh,
biggest risk of your career.
so to that last point you made, whenever people come to me and go, "Hey, I want your career," I said, "You can't." And they said, "Why?" I said, "It's a random walk through the woods of embracing risk the entire freaking time." But I didn't know I was embracing it. I just kind of did it, right? There, a friend of mine wrote a book called, I think it's Talk for Leaders or whatever. David Pearl, incredible dude. He was an executive coach at Barclays. Somebody said, "Boe is fearless." He goes, "No, Bo's not fearless. Boe has made fear his friend." Right? And that to me is I think the best way, because I'm still scared about different things, right? I have to work through it. But the roads that led to that moment, right? They were years, days, and hours that led to that moment. And where it was is I had to write my end of the year review. And inside of banks, by the way, you have to write this magnum opus every year. It's just the most painful thing in the world. What I would do is I would have my chief of staff collect everybody else's self review so that I could look through it and then say, "Hey, this is how I'm going to review myself based on that." What got me was I was in such a down place. I was such a dark place the morning I sat down in my house in London to write my review. I started reading everyone else's review because I felt our numbers were plateauing, right? We just weren't seeing that exponential launch that we were. I saw the numbers plateauing. I was not a pleasant person to be around, right? I wasn't sleeping at night. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest on a regular basis. I was I was just not my best person, and I wasn't leading from a place of curiosity. I was leading from a place of defense. When I read everyone else's review, I realized it was the best year we'd ever have. The numbers of project delivery and customer satisfaction and revenue increase and efficiencies made and people saying that they feel more engaged in their work than they've ever felt before was phenomenal, was incredible. And I was blind to what was really happening in my organization
Mhm.
because I got into my own head and I wasn't connecting with people because I was closing in on myself. And people were talking about the incredible things I could list off all the cool stuff we did. And I was missing all of it. All of it. That blind spot that just sat there. And if I go back and I look at that, think about how many times, whether professionally or personally, when we start crashing in on ourselves, we miss all the good that's happening with our families and our friends and the things happening around us, and we doom scroll because we need that next shot of endorphin hit and stuff like that. And I was missing it, and I was missing it because I was scared. And so that was the climactic point of the story, but it
Mhm.
just led into it for years,
Yeah.
years, months, days, and hours to that moment where just things clicked for me. And then we were in Pune, India, the night before I was going to go present. People were calling my chief of staff, going, "Is he really going to do this? Like, is he really, really going to do this?" And the night before, we were going over the material just to make sure I was confident. And it was the weirdest thing in the world. Is my head of HR and my chief of staff were putting the deck together, and I was sitting next to them as they were putting it, and they were actually talking to each other and not me. So it was kind of weird, like I was a third person kind of watching them. And then there was a moment as they were going through the words and saying them out loud to each other that there was a moment that kind of like it hit me. And I went, I think I'm scared. I think I'm scared. And that was the moment that I went, I think I'm scared. And so I went through the rest of the night. I went through breakfast, had a few meetings in the morning. And when I got up on stage, because I knew I was scared at that moment, and I pointed back just like this, and I pointed at all the feedback, I stopped. My shoulders shrugged for the first time. I weren't wearing them as earrings anymore. I took a deep breath. The room truly froze. It truly froze. And I exhaled and I said, I'm scared. And that was the moment that just the gasp took place. And that was the moment when I got to the other side of it, I knew I was freed from that particular thing. I was freed from that event. And by saying it once, I went, I think I'm on the other side. And that blind spot went away. So even though I still have peaks and valleys, even though I try to be on the plateau, even though I'll have good days and bad days, I always go back to that reflection of what am I scared of at this moment? And when I was going through charm, I call it charm school at Goldman Sachs before I got made a partner, we had this activity where they took us, a few of us down to Washington, D.C. And one night before dinner, we had to ask each other participant one question. And the coaches were looking at us and what they're doing, and they're standing over. And my question when people stepped up to me was, what's your relationship with fear? And the coaches pulled me aside and they said, where did that come from? I gave them sort of the background. And they went, that's probably one of the best questions we've ever heard in our time. Because executives refuse to accept that they are fearful or scared of something.
And they certainly won't say it publicly like you did.
They certainly won't say it. They won't say it publicly. So,
Yeah.
anyways,
Wow.
kind of a long journey there, but
Yeah.
that fundamentally changed and so I always ask myself, what am I scared of?
Yeah.
Right.
And I can imagine that experience helped you. I heard you say earlier that it sounds like your wife's going to be okay, but cancer is not an easy thing to make it through while you're also in a startup company.
Actually, all the things I just said to you prepared me for that moment, right? And by the way, a lot of your listeners are going on these journeys, and I want to share this journey just so that maybe it might help one or two people. So I have two daughters. One's graduated from college. The other one is halfway through college. But the oldest was in college. The youngest was in senior year in high school when my wife got diagnosed. And I knew we were going to get that diagnosis, by the way. There were too many follow-ups, way too many follow-ups. And I went, I know what's coming. I know what's coming. I had that fear in me, right? She had that fear, but she wasn't talking about it, right? And so when the diagnosis landed, we said, okay, we got it. We got the diagnosis. And so we had to bring the immediate family together to say, hey, we have something to share. Now, Hartman family meetings don't happen very often. So everybody kind of got what was going on that. And I knew that we were going to get the best care for my wife, but that uncertainty of it. And she's the one actually going through it, right? So she had all the questions and concerns that are going on. But we had to tell these two young women that their role model has stage 3 breast cancer. Man, dude, I got to tell you, hardest thing to do, right? Yeah. My oldest daughter was actually on FaceTime because she was off to college, right? My youngest daughter actually literally stopped breathing at that moment. And I was like, holy crap, she stopped breathing. My oldest daughter is my clone, right? And stone-faced, the look on her face, I'm like, oh my God. And I'm like, hope. And so I decided I was going to call them the next couple of days. So I pulled my youngest aside over breakfast and she had a good cry and we had a good talk, right? So I'm like, mom's going to be okay. My oldest, I called her. And I didn't have fear. I had fear of the future because at this point, it's out of my control. It's between a doctor and cancer, how that's going to be resolved, right? I had zero control of the situation, but I called. And I said to her, I said, how you doing? And she went, I'm not okay. Because she had heard the stories of me being on that stage saying I'm scared. Yeah. And she said, I'm not okay. And she sat in her Jeep and she cried to me for 45 minutes. She said, I'm not okay that. So the reason I give all that background and the I'm scared sort of thing is the next day I go into work. And we go in the office 3 days a week. And I had to tell folks at work that I'm not going to be my best every day because we're dealing with this. Someone asked me, and I turned to them and I said, I'm not okay. For the first time in my life, the first time in my life. I had been broken bones. I'd been in the hospital. I'd seen some really, really bad things in my life. And for the first time in my life, I literally, when someone said, "How are you doing?" and it was a cursory sort of where you're supposed to say, "I'm doing okay." I said, "I'm not okay." That empowered me. And I tell folks, those are powerful words when you say to folks, "I'm not okay." But you know what? For the next hour, I'm going to make it through. And the hour after that, I'm going to make it through. And the next day, I'm going to make it through that. And the day after that, I'm going to make it through. But
Wow, well,
that's where I'm
that's
at today.
also an important framework you just kind of snuck in there, right? Which is hour by hour sometimes.
Trust me, hour by hour, right?
Yeah.
And so what I tell folks is when you're leading individuals, don't let the blind spot be, I got to be in founder mode. I got to have all the right answers. I got to go where I'm going. I mean, you have to have a vision. You have to have drive. You have to have a playbook. You have to have these things, right? And if you have those things, you have a lot of toolkits. But even with those tools, it's not clear how you're going to go forward or what's holding you back. And my Zoom camera comes in a dramatic sort of way. But the power then to let everyone else know, I don't know, but we are going to make it through. What I know is the next hour we're going to make it. And in Nomi's history, we've had moments like that going, you know what? I don't know how we're going to make 2 weeks from now, but I know we're going to make it the next hour. We're going to make it the next day.
Mm, mm.
And that's what we're going to go do.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, you certainly have been very generous in this hour of contributing to other leaders, and wow, your experience, and you continue, right, to, it sounds like you're very self-reflective. You continue to look at your part of things first before you look at, what other people are or aren't doing well. So I've got, I know you've got to go to your next hour of
Yeah.
meetings,
Yeah.
but to have maybe one or two more questions that
Lay
are
them
going
on
to
me.
be a lot easier based on these amazing experiences that you've
Yeah.
just shared. But earlier you mentioned a framework, and a lot of
Mm-hmm.
new leaders don't have frameworks. They didn't come from the Goldman Sachs and all that.
Yep.
So mention an action framework, I think is what you said.
Action cycle. Oh, one of my
Can you say
favorites in the world.
something?
Action cycles. Yes. The action cycle is it came from some training that Capital One put me through. Capital One put me through some of the most incredible training on the planet, right? And they used me as a lab rat and a couple of my peers as lab rats, and they would always send us to the innovative training at the time. One of them was called Sports Mind at the time, and it was a week of ropes course, which a lot of lessons came out of those rope courses, believe it or not, and then there was a year of learning teams where you would read a white paper, and it's how to communicate, why organizations lose their curiosity, that sort of stuff. One of them was on action cycles and the way that we interact with one another, right? Customer performer. It's not master slave. There's proposals and counter proposals and offers, and so I use that framework to teach people to say, if you are making a request, so you're the customer, to someone who's going to be your performer, let's be clear on what you're asking. Hey, performer, make sure you're clear to understand what they are. But by the same time, it's not master slave. You
Mm.
are equal in this. And in being equal in this, you both have accountabilities to each other to actually deliver on something. And I have used that framework since the moment I learned it all the way up to today. Even I've taught all my organizations this. What's funny is I still have the white papers from the 1990, and I'll go back and I'll read it and I'll go, God, I wish that phrase was there the first time I read it. It's it's the original piece of paper. So it is like I keep relearning, I keep becoming a student over and over again. But action cycles, being clear on the deliverables, not master slave, but collaborators to work together, and that empowers somebody. It makes your no's and yeses mean something, but it also teaches you is how are you complicit in the calcification of the organization that you're a part of, right? Because if someone makes a request and you just kind of go through the motions, you're complicit in that outcome. And how are you complicit?
Wow, well, that it sounds like that framework sets people up for success and will naturally show you who's the right fit and who's not the right
Yeah.
fit. Would you agree?
Yes, and it gives people both on the requesting side and the performing side the tools to actually interact, right? And it gives you a framework instead of going just go do something. It actually makes you go, do I understand it? Like the example they use, by the way, is actually a great example. If I were to ask you, bring me a glass of water, and you just bring me a glass of water, and I go, but I wanted ice, and you go, but you didn't say you wanted ice. I wanted it in a glass, not a paper cup, but you didn't say that. But you didn't ask, did you? right? And so it's funny though, when I meet up with when I've had people from that time period of my life work for me at later stages, I always point out as I'm teaching action cycles, I go, it's really awkward because you have to use the words. I'm offering a counter proposal. We had to do that weird stuff, dude. Just weird. It was strange. But when
It worked.
when you it worked, but when you talk to us later together, or they work for me later, we would use normal language, but you could actually see the negotiation take place. And I would point that out to people. I go, we're using different words, by the way, but he just asked me, I made a request to have it done on Tuesday. He just came back to me and said, would Wednesday be okay?
Yeah.
I said, that's a request. That's a counter proposal. Right. I
Yeah.
mean, and believe it or not, we all think we know what we're asking when we really don't. And then sometimes it's okay to say, I don't have all the answers, but I think I want to go do this. And the person go, my offer is let me go a few days to do some research and I will come back and show you iterations of it. What do you say? That's a great proposal. Let me take that. Right.
And a
And
good
again, it
partnership.
and good part, and it takes the emotion out of it and it
Yeah.
gets, and it helps you. It's a framework. It's a playbook that you could practice.
Yes. Wow. Well, that again, you contributed so much, and thank you for the examples of that framework. You brought it to life, and so you address the loneliness. Then one more question I have
Of
is
course.
as we wrap up is a lot of leaders their answer to making it successful, to making the
Mhm.
company successful is to sleep less, work harder. So, and a lot of people are now suffering health wise, right? And the stress levels
Yep.
are high and sleep is low. How have you managed that? And any last tip you have for others?
Yeah, gosh, that is so true. When I was at Barclays, by the way, I was traveling the globe probably 70% of the time. I gained 60 pounds. Not a great experience, by the way. To operate at that level, you have to participate at a high level. The thing that I look back and I'm trying to impress upon my children is don't give up hobbies. I lost my hobbies for over a decade. When people ask me, what do you do? I work, right? I lost connections with others, this loneliness epidemic that we're seeing, right? And so what I have done in the intervening years though is I have found the things that create energy for me because I got a great piece of advice one day that said, your job is your job and you have to do the thing, but figure out how your job can also let you engage in the things that energize you. So what energizes me? Curiosity. So at at Capital One, Barclays, and at Goldman, I would actually volunteer my time at local incubators for startups. I would just go for a couple hours and I would just volunteer my time. And I drew energy from the excitement and the opportunity. And that recharged me, right? That
Mhm.
didn't feel like I was draining. That day I talked about that self review,
Yeah.
I allowed myself to drain to nearly nothing. And I was not bringing the best. By going out to these incubators, and by the way, incubators will take any of your listeners in a heartbeat to say, you come in 1 or 2 hours a week and just mentor some of these young companies. And I got to be honest with you, it energized me. It gives me ideas whenever I'm feeling like I am low on my tank. I call up some of my friends that are running mid-sized companies. I ask for advice. I give them advice. I hear what they're working on. I tell them what the things that they're struggling with, and I get so educated on what's happening in the world. But by the same token, I get the energy of the curiosity and opportunity. So find the things you draw energy from
Mm.
and engage in those things, and it will make you a better leader, and it will help you to keep that tank from empty. And the other thing is, no matter, even I had a long week and traveling around and had to stay up late for whatever it is, I always try to set aside time to on the weekends to take a nap, right, or sleep in. My wife and I would always trade off. She would sleep in on Saturdays, I'd sleep in on Sundays. Partnership, what are those times to really really recharge and really get grounded? Because don't do the gain 60 pounds thing. It's not awesome.
Wow, well, Bo, you have certainly recharged me in this hour, and I can see what an outstanding guest you have been. And I know if people want to know more about your company, they can go to nomihealth.com. But if we don't watch it, you'll get a bunch of calls of people get energized by you.
Yeah,
Anyway, thank you
yeah.
again for being on the show.
No, Bridget, thank you. Thanks again, Birgit. I really appreciate your time, and it was a blast.